controlling millions of people who lack basic human rights, the right to be a citizen of the country in which they live, is a fundamental affront to the political principle of equality under the law and to the theological principle of equality under God.
Historical record aside and politics aside, we are where we are. We're in a position where the vast majority of Israelis are supporting the existing status quo, or at least the directional status quo.
Yes.
And we now have a position where two-state solution sounds great, but is further away from being a reality than it ever has been in my lifetime.
Yeah.
What does that mean to the Jewish core? What does that mean to the Jewish identity in Israel?
Well, I think the first thing I want to note is just that when we use the term Israeli, I think it's in some ways a very slippery phrase, right? For this reason. Um, Most of the Palestinians under Israeli control can't become citizens of the state. So we wouldn't call them Israelis, even though they essentially live within the state of Israel. And even the 20%, even the minority of Palestinians who have citizenship in Israel, we call Arab Israelis, are very rarely referred to in these conversations as Israelis. So when people say the Israeli population moved way to the right after the Second Intifada, or most Israelis reject the Second Intifada, we essentially use the term in ethno-national terms as to be referring only to Jewish Israelis. And this to me is part of the problem with the whole basis of Israeli politics, in which even those Palestinians who have citizenship are essentially delegitimized as political actors. And I think it goes back to the question that you asked earlier about the politics of the country, right? Israel moving to the right. If there were to be a genuine left in Israel that could really contest for power, its political base would be Palestinian citizens of Israel. Just like in the Democratic Party, the base of the Democratic Party is Black Americans, because if you have an equality-oriented politics of the left, people who suffer the most inequality are you going to be your strongest natural constituency. But Palestinian citizens are not, even though they can vote, are not really considered legitimate actors in the Israeli political system, right? It's very difficult. A government that would rely on them for its coalition majority would not generally be considered a legitimate government. So this is part of the problem with, to me, with the entire idea of ethno-nationalism, which we have to put on the table as we try to assess Israeli politics.
Well, those are fair points all, but the voting public guides where Israel's history and politics goes.
Right.
And as a result, the voting public, which has been in control, regardless of what constitutes that bloc, has
Mhm.
moved Israel to a position, and that position is now the reality where
Yeah.
all people find themselves, regardless of whether they can vote or not. And the
Yeah.
question is, in that reality, how do we anchor our Jewish values and where do we go from here?
Right. So look, there is no consensus on what constitutes Jewish values. As you know, our texts, the rabbis compare the Talmud to the ocean, to the sea, right? So there are many, many different voices. I would never claim that there is one that the principle of equality is the only or even the core Jewish value. There are many, many, many Jewish values, and our texts speak in radically different voices. So all I can say are those voices within the tradition that speak most clearly powerfully to me. And to me, in my Jewish values, the central idea that God creates all human beings equally in God's image, and that happens before the covenant with Abraham and before the story of Bnei Israel, before the Jewish story, with universal human beings, Adam, Eve, Noah, the people of the Tower of Babel, etc. That's ultimately, for me, the foundational lens through which I view everything, human equality. And so from that perspective, controlling millions of people who lack basic human rights, the right to be a citizen of the country in which they live, is a fundamental affront to the political principle of equality under the law and to the theological principle of equality under God. And so to me, it's a very, very profound moral and spiritual crisis to have Israel not only holding people under these conditions of legal inferiority, but in fact killing them in large numbers.